This is Damian Macy, representing the Friends of the Marshall Public Library in our Oral History Project. Today is Thursday, November the 5th, and I'm at the library with John Hoggatt, who is a local resident. He's been here most of his life, and he has owned a business in Marshall. And I think John probably has a story to tell you. So with that, I'll introduce you to John.
Thank you. Well, I've lived most of my life I started my life in Clark Center, and that also known as Auburn. And it was called Auburn before it was Clark Center because the name Auburn was taken away and given to another town, and they call it Clark Center because it's the center of Clark County, and it's where the courthouse was supposed to be. Well, anyhow, my mother came from Marshall. She married George Brandenstein. Or no, I take that back. Her dad was George Brandenstein. And my grandmother was a Barrett. And so we were related to the Barretts and the Brandensteins. And my mother grew up and was raised by the Barretts because my grandfather moved to Michigan and started another life. He lost his wife in 1910 due to a typhoid epidemic. And they're buried at Clark Center. The grandmother and my mother and father and my brother, a lot of my relatives is buried at Clark Center, although I will be buried in Marshall Cemetery because I have a stone out there that we got together and put in.
John, is that the cemetery on the north side?
North side of the highway.
Where the church used to be?
That was the church I attended when I was a child. Mm-hmm. And it's a Methodist church. My grandfather came in his late years in life to visit my mother. He came a couple times, and he stayed at my house at the first time, and we was building a new house, and he stayed there and traveled out to Clark Center and visited my mother. But then the next year when he came, he decided he was going to stay with my mother. Well, anyhow, he stayed the first night. He got up the next morning, went for a walk, and he went up to the cemetery where his first wife was buried. And probably as he was walking across the highway, he had his mind on other things, and he stepped out in front of a semi, but he seen what he done, and he began to run. Of course, he was about 87 years old, and he ran right in the path of another car, and he died at the hospital. But then that was, that was back in the 60s, like 64, 5, 6, something right along in there. But anyhow, I went to grade school at Clark Center, and my father had went to work for the Ford Motor Company back right after they was married, and then he would come home on every 2 weeks and visit for the weekend, and then he and another co-worker, one from Casey, that traveled back and forth. And
where was he working for Ford? Did he go to Detroit? Or to
no,
Michigan?
he worked in Hammond or Chicago. Heglish, I think is where it was. They've got, I think they had more than one plant up there.
Yeah, I think so.
But he was painting, and the painting is what he done. And I suppose he had a brother that worked up there too, but that was where the work was back during the Depression, and right after he and Mom got married, he had to go, and he had to find a job, and he found a job in Ford Motor Company, and that was available at that time. And so anyhow, he worked there for several years up into the 40s before he finally decided that home was in Clark Center, and he quit up there and moved back.
A good place to come back to then.
Good place to come back to.
John, you mentioned school, and I can remember there was a 2-room school, I think, along Old Route 40 in Clark Center. Is that where you went to school?
That's where I went to school. And I have a picture of the class of 1939, and I was in the picture. I was visiting school, and I got in the class picture of 1939. Now, I was born in 1935, December of 1935. So this was the class of 39 I took. So I was 3 years old, and I was in that school picture. But anyhow.
You started school at an early age.
At an early age. And we, of course, back then we had recess, and we played games, and we really enjoyed school. It was, well, I've always enjoyed it, but it wasn't until, well, when you get in high school, it's somewhat different, you know.
Can you tell us a little bit about that school?
Well, yeah, we had playground out there. We had a slide and swings and a merry-go-round, and we had a coal shed out there. We'd play Annie over, they called it, where you throwed the ball over and they caught it on the other side and pitched it back, and we played tag a lot, and played ball, and the children all played together. You know, they especially, you know, when they was all out together. Well, they played a lot of times. Some of them would go play on the slide or the swings, but you know, they played together too. And I've often thought, I've got a metal detector. I was like to go over, and I asked the person that owned it if it would be all right if I could find any mementos of the school days, but of course I don't know that I will. But then,
with the 2 rooms, there were all 8 grades there?
well, at one time, then I think at the last we had all of them in one room. They had one teacher, and we went to a 1 room because there wasn't that many children. And I think it was in 51 that they consolidated and started taking us. They started about a year earlier taking us by bus in for PE of an evening, 1 day a week, I think. And then the next year, I was in my 8th grade when I started my 8th grade. When they started, they had the 7th and 8th, and then the high school. And I started my 8th grade in Mrs. Kelly's room. She was the teacher, Mrs. Kelly and Mrs. Perkins and Mrs. Hutchison's. I don't remember whether it was Hutchins or Hutchison, but it was the 3 teachers that was teaching, and I was in Mrs. Kelly's room.
I had an Ethel Hutchison
Yeah.
my 4th grade teacher. Would that have been the same one?
Yeah, it was the same one.
Yeah.
And they handled things well, and then of course we got to know the 7th graders because they was over in the old building, and they would maybe have a class they'd come through, but we'd meet them in the hall and see them going from one class to another, because they had classrooms over in the old building. And of course, I remember when the storm damaged the high school. I lived in Clark Center at the time, and we had a bad storm, tornado, and it damaged the high school, and well, then they built the new one, but they used the gym and some of the room they kept intact. It was over the industrial arts and, well, the dressing room for the PE and so forth. So they used the old building for that.
John, when you were growing up in Clark Center, did you have certain chores and all that you had to do at home?
Oh, well, certainly. And we had, at one time, there was 4 or 5 grocery stores in that town, 2 filling stations.
Wow.
And they was the remainder of when I growed up there, but I think there used to be a saloon in town.
Probably.
I think Hertz lived there on that property at the time, but it didn't have a tavern on it at that time. But Shirley Hurt, Luther Hurt, that run the junkyard here at
Oh, yeah.
Marshall, he came to Clark Center first before he moved to Marshall. And of course I knew them well. You get in a small town like Clark Center, you get to know everybody.
Well, with those number of grocery stores, and even there were a lot in Marshall at one time, do you think that was primarily because people did not usually drive, so they had a place that they could walk to get their groceries?
Well, they drove, but they didn't drive as far. They just didn't drive as far. But I remember that we had a grocery store we built a grocery store in the 50s, and we had a grocery store across the street from us. And, well, Jim Conemacher and Mary Hendricks, they had one down there at the west end of town. And we had a blacksmith shop, and we had a lot of going on in a small town, and I used to hang around all of them, you know. I mean, the blacksmith shop, he was always playing around with a project like maybe a little pulling tractor or car or something like that the kids could play with. And of course, Ray Baker run that garage down there where Yargis is, and he had a hot seat in there, and he had a lot of fun playing around with people that stopped for gasoline or the local residents, and getting them caught on that hot seat. But once they knew it was there, they didn't get caught too many times. But they get a lot of loafers. Were
there a couple of gas stations in Clark Center at that time?
Yeah, they was there at the Ray Baker's, and then Miles Hughes had the Shell station. And when the Army trucks used to come through in the convoys, they had the old pumps that you pump, I think it was 5 or 10 gallons up in the top, and then they would release the gas and measure it as it was. Mm-hmm. Well, anyhow, I've been over there a lot of times and helped. I thought I was helping, but by pumping and helping him fill those convoy trucks, they'd stop there and they'd be there for quite a while. He'd pump a lot of gas, but anyhow.
Do you recall what the price per gallon of gas was about that?
Oh, I remember when it was less than 25 cents. Yes, 25 cents or less, maybe. And I remember when it was rationed and you had to have stamps.
Stamp.
Yeah, and it was, tires was hard to get. You had to buy used tires if you could get them. And we went to Marshall one night on a Saturday night, and we had 5 flat tires before we got, until, from the time we left to the time we got back. When we pulled in the front yard, there was a tire going down, and it made 5 flat tires that we received that on that particular trip, and that was an exception. I mean, but that's the reason it stayed with me so well.
I remember a lot of people used, especially travelers, you would find a couple of tires tied on the back or on a fender or something as they were going through.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, oh, I see so many things when you're telling about things like that, the memories keep coming back of instances that happened out there where, oh, just the people that, as they play routinely out, the things that goes on, that went on, like the high school kids, they got to school the best way they could. Sometimes it was hitchhiking, but they didn't have a bus to pick them up and take them to school, and they got there the best way they could. If they could drive and had a car, they drive, and if not,
I
they
believe
hitchhike.
some of the country students stayed at someplace in town too,
Yeah,
with a
yeah. I had
family
a
or-
brother. I had an uncle that lived in town that he worked for him in the pool room and stayed there, and that way he didn't have to run back and forth. And he made some extra money and went to school. And
With growing up in Clark County, obviously your groceries and everything you could buy locally. But did you come to Marshall or Martinsville or Terre Haute much on shopping trips?
we'd go, they had a bus, and we'd take the bus either to town, or if it was in the cards, we'd go to Terre Haute. I mean, sometimes we had things we had to go to Terre Haute for, or we thought we did, and we'd take the bus to Terre Haute, and it's usually an all-day thing. You know, you go early in the morning and come back later in the evening. But anyhow, and that was when the downtown Terre Haute was elbow to elbow. When you went to Terre Haute, it was elbow to elbow. Everybody was filling the sidewalks. And
at Christmas time, it was even more so. You couldn't find a place to park,
well,
right?
we didn't drive, we rode the bus. But yeah, that's true. Later on in life, when you did drive, well, yeah, you finding a place to park. Well, they used to have parking meters here in Marshall.
Right.
They decided they wanted to make some money off all those customers. If they're going to shop here, they're going to pay to park. Oh, sight.
You mentioned the convoy coming through Clark Center. And of course, that was at a time when Route 40 was a major thoroughfare, and it went right through downtown Clark Center. Is that
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, the highway went right through Clark Center.
That's what I mean.
I lived right on that highway. I remember many times going to sleep, and the semis, we had a hill on each side, and they was all just getting wound up from climbing that hill on each side, and they'd be getting some speed to, building up their speed, and so they made quite a bit of noise. And then we had the railroad up north.
Yeah.
The train noise was just as apparent as it would be if you was right next to the track. I mean, other than maybe the ground shaking.
Was that highway through Clark Center brick at that time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought so.
Yeah. It got blacktopped after the highway went around.
Yeah.
And they put that coal mix on it, and they're planning right now to redo that through the town, because it's it's getting big trucks there from Yargus Manufacturing.
A lot of people.
He's about taken over the town, and he's about bought up all the ground. It was a bad place for him to settle, but what can you say? The town, it's been good and it's been bad for the town. The old voting house where you voted out there, they don't vote there anymore, and the building it looks terrible and probably needs to be tore down, but they don't use it anymore for anything. The church has been tore down. It was there for many years, but when my brother passed on, there wasn't anyone else to support it, and he supported it for many years. He and three others that, attended church. Now, because they was probably many times, they was maybe 4 or 5 there, and he was pretty faithful to it, and seeing that they had their homecoming, they'd have a homecoming once a year, and people that had moved away come and have a big meal at the church, and it was something they looked forward to.
Do you know when that church was started?
No, I don't know when it was started. It's probably on this, they made I don't know what you want to call it, but they got the bell. Yargus,
Yeah.
they're going to set the bell up there and put some dates on it. But
Okay.
I remember once when it caught on fire, and my mom was up there cleaning it at the time, and the residents went up there, they started a bucket brigade, and they got the fire put out, but then...
Was it from the stove or some ashes or something? Or?
I don't recall, but she was up there cleaning at the time, and probably from the stove, I don't know, but there was a fire, they got it out, but then back then didn't have a good phone system, and you had like rang 2 longs and a short, and you might never get central. And I came home after being in town one night, and my neighbor across the street, their house was on fire. And they started trying to call, and I said, I'll go get the fire department just in case. And I went into Marshall and
You drove in?
I notified them. They had a telephone, people were trying to use the phone to get it, but you couldn't get through to Central. So anyhow, and I knew how it was, so that's the reason I went, because I figured I might be quicker getting it done than the telephone, but now it's quite a bit different. We got better communications, but anyhow.
So you remember the days of the 2 longs and a short,
Oh, yeah.
2 shorts and 5 longs? Or
We
whatever?
didn't have a phone. We would go in the grocery store or to a neighbor that could afford a phone and use it. But no, we didn't have a phone in our house until, much later date.
You didn't have one in your pocket either, did you?
No, not like today.
John, with the coming into Marshall, are there things you remember about early Marshall when you were coming into town in those years?
Yeah, we came in on the brick highway all the way, and then they put in 40, and that was in the 50s. And it was that way all the way. It was brick all the way through Marshall and to Terre Haute.
Oh, I believe.
And there was some pretty steep hills, and I recall many places where we'd had flat tires, and we got acquainted with that place when we'd pull off to fix a flat tire. If our spare wasn't, if our spare had already been used, then we had to take the tire off and patch it to get by. or to get back on the road.
So during those Depression years then, even though, did your family have a car at that time?
Yeah, we had 2 or 3 of them, but we only had one that would run. The other 2 were for parts.
Do you recall what kind of car it was?
Model A's. We got a Model T once, but it wasn't the family car. It was just one that he traded for, and then I don't remember what we done with it, but anyhow, we traded for it. But we'd usually have a Model A or 2, or back at one time we had a 35 Oldsmobile, and I bought my first car was a 36 Plymouth. I bought it off my brother. He had it pretty well wore out, and then I finished it up, but then that was my first car.
Don't you wish you had one of those cars today?
Well, yeah, I've got several cars, and I've got.
I thought you did.
But there's some that I wish for, yeah.
When you were, say, finishing school there, and you mentioned coming into town, had the bus system started at that time?
Well,
the school bus system?
Yeah, the bus system started in 50.
With the consolidation, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, the bus system started a little bit before, because they started bringing us in for PE.
You mentioned that.
And then the next year, they started bringing us in for school. And we attended school. And I think that was in 51, because Dick Wallace, my next door neighbor, he was in high school, and he graduated, I think, in 51. And I graduated in 54. So, but we played together a lot and run off together if we run off, and got in trouble together, go fishing together, go on picnics, just what you do around a small village.
Did you have any particular memories of Marshall coming in from the country? Here's the city of Marshall.
Well, yes, on the corner building down here where Shore Parker is, used to be a drugstore, and it had a wall there. They put the names of all the soldiers that served in the service, and they had honored them by putting their name on the wall. I remember that. And
I believe that was Benson's drugstore.
Yeah, it was Benson's drugstore when it was. And then, of course, I think when Paul Martin, he bought that one and then he moved it. I think that's the way it was. And maybe, I forget now whether it was I know Bennett and Bennett was upstairs, up over the drugstore in the upstairs, and then they moved. But yeah, I remember a lot about early Marshall, the old harness shop, and that belonged to my grandparents. And they had the horse in there, and I'd always put me on the horse when they'd take me in there.
I was always fascinated walking by, even when we went to Tom's, to see that horse standing in there.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered, does anyone know where that went or what happened?
Well, I think Basil Moore, of course, Johnny Max Branstein worked down there, and he was pretty close to John Branstein, Max's dad. And I'm thinking that Basil Moore run that down. Somebody run that down, that horse. I'm not sure where it went, but it's kind of like that and the popcorn wagon. That's a couple of things that was in the history of Marshall that they had to search for, and I forget what the outcome was. I mean, they got a popcorn wagon back. I don't know whether it's the same one or not.
Apparently they verified that it was.
Yeah, okay. And of course I remember when Vernon Pruitt used to run it back when I was in high school. or maybe when I was still in grade school, I don't know. But it's, he run it early on, I know, Vernon.
How about some of the other businesses kind of coming around town? How about the old Strand Theater? Did you ever go to a movie there?
My aunt, John Brandenstein's wife, she sold tickets there.
Oh.
Alona Brandenstein, she was a Kiger, and she sold tickets there for a long time, and of course, that didn't get me in free, but then I knew who I was buying my ticket off of, and then later on, I joined the KP Lodge, and the KP Lodge was
Upstairs.
headquartered up over the Strand Theater, and of course it burnt in about 56 or 7, and I was in town the night it burned,
Oh,
but anyhow, it was a big fire, I know that. And then the hotel, of course, it burnt too, but that there was a lot later on.
the old Marshall House?
Yeah, I remember when it burned. Of course, I had my business right across the street from it when well, let's see. I'm not sure whether I owned it at that time or not when it burned, but I didn't own it at that time. It was probably the old E&L restaurant. No, I owned it when it burned. I owned it when it burned because Howard Young owned it at that time. But anyhow, yeah. And I remember when I was running around town at an earlier age, the tractor, Russ Laird had the implement building in the senior citizens building down there, and he had a tractor on display, and that thing caught on fire. Someone either, well, accidentally or intentionally set fire to it, but that tractor got on fire, and I remember we went down and alerted the fire department in the car and let them know that it was on fire so they could come down and put it out. That was, I don't know, it might have been on a Saturday night. It was a night that we were in town. We didn't come to town just every night of the week, but.
Saturdays were kind of special then.
Well, that, or of course there used to be an auction house. Leslie Claypool had an auction house down there, just next to the drugstore, Blankenship's drugstore. And anyhow, we'd come in. I think maybe the auction was on Friday nights, and it was either Friday or Saturday nights. But anyhow, we'd sometimes go at the auction. We had an old 35 Oldsmobile with a rumble seat, and I would ride in the rumble seat with what things we had purchased if we could haul them home. Well, I'd be in the back with it, but anyhow.
Did $1 go pretty long ways too?
Well, it went a lot further than it does today.
Yep.
You could still buy a cup of coffee for a nickel.
Do you remember what the fare or your price was to get into the Strand Theater?
You know, I don't. Seems to me like 25, 30 cents, something like that. It wasn't extremely high, but I forget now I don't recall what.
Well, I remember as a young.
I didn't go every movie. I mean, until I got old enough that some of the girls that I might want to associate with, I might go to a movie, but so we could maybe drop some popcorn out of the balcony down on the
As a youngster, and my aunt used to take me once in a while, the youth fare was 9 cents.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it kept moving up, and I don't know what the adult price was at that time. But.
Well, I don't remember what it was, but I know Lona she sold tickets, and then there was a Marietta Clapp fella that was an usher, and there was also a June Kramer, Jerry Brossman's wife's sister, June, where she's gone now, but she was an usher, and I remember them well. And then, of course, they sold candy and popcorn and stuff, and
I think those candy bars and maybe even the bag of popcorn was only a nickel.
yeah, they wasn't much. They wasn't much. They didn't hold you up for it like they do now. It's pathetic.
Do you have memories of a favorite subject in high school?
Oh, I didn't. Oh, I liked my dark room and making pictures, and then my first year of high school, I went out for football, and I liked more the managing part, and we'd cook some soup, have a light meal for the football team before they played, and take care of washing the equipment, keeping it clean and stuff like that. And that's what I did my second, third, and fourth year. And I lined the football field, and I was the coach's go-to boy to get things done.
Which is an important part of getting things done.
Oh yeah. And usually they'd excuse me from class if I was, busy. They'd excuse me that I could, if I was needed out there on the field, why, they'd excuse me from class to go ahead and get it done, because they knew what I was doing was important to.
Do you remember some of your teachers that you had at that time?
Oh yeah. I remember. They was. I remember Truman Spittler, of course, and Dennis Swayze, and Reuben Hornbrook, Mildred Hutchins, where she taught typing, and of course I didn't have a class with them, but I knew Violet Schaffner, and of course Rachel Griffith. She was the girls' PE teacher, and she was always nice to me, and she was a good customer when I later started a business in town. Well, she traded with me, and as did most of them. They were good friends throughout my life. Then I remember a Mr. Moore too. He was a good teacher.
Well, I'll reverse that question. Is there a subject that you really didn't like, didn't care for?
I wasn't very fond of English, but other than that, that's about the only one that I wasn't very fond of. I remember Mr. Heaton, he was a coach, and then that George Gaddis, he was a coach, and Don McNary, and of course Mr. Harrington, he used to be the principal.
So going through high school then, maybe the sports was one of the major things that you took part in. Did you think time in high school of, here's what I might want to do, or I might want to own a business?
Well, they had the DO program, but they didn't offer that when I was in school, but they offered it after I got out. But I thought that was a good program for all the students, even if they figured out they didn't want to do it. They was ahead when they got out of school, if they got it out of their system, but it would be a good experience for them for the rest of their life, because they're dealing usually with the public, and I think that's an experience by itself. But I worked for Armour. They came to town. It was a night job, and sometimes have to wait until 10, 12 o'clock at night. But that was in either my junior or senior year, so it wasn't all through school, but they wanted someone to load their trucks so that they'd be ready to go out early and make their deliveries, and I worked for them.
Where was that located?
In the old Armour, well, the building down there by TRW, they had another business in there, Supermat.
Okay.
And they had that in that building. That's been there for a while, because see, that was back in the 50s when that took place. So that building's been there for a while. But it was a fairly new building then.
So during high school?
During high school, I also worked for Heber Nash.
Yes.
Heber Nash he had a gas delivery business, plus he had a gift shop. And I worked for him for a year or two and delivered gas after school.
I remember his business when it was about the place where Bill Mealing's office is now.
Yeah, the Ratty Makers was the first one, and then his
Heber Nash
was the next.
Then he moved down to the corner here, right on the corner of 6th and Archer for a while, when that building came down.
No, he moved. Let's see. No, I'm thinking another. No, he never was in the corner building, I don't think. He's not Heber Nash.
I thought he did.
Well,
Maybe not.
well, not that my knowledge. He passed and I'm trying to think I don't recall him ever being up here, but anyhow, maybe not, but,
I remember his gas delivery, the tank said dry gas on them.
yeah,
I never could figure out what that meant.
wasn't no moisture in it.
I guess not. But my folks bought a new stove, and I remember him delivering it and hooking it up for them.
Well, Creel Stout used to be in
Yeah.
the gas business too, and of course I knew Bob and his sister, and we bought a stove off of them, back in the 40s, and they moved from uptown. I think up there, I'm trying to think of the building they was in for sure, but it was up there across the street from the harness shop, I believe. But anyhow, they moved to the filling station out here, and they still they had a gas business, and
As I recall, it was right almost in their front yard, too.
yeah,
The gas station.
yeah, the station was right there as you
And
come
their house
into
was
town.
right behind it.
And of course, then there was another gas station up there where Ralph George had
Yeah.
his grocery store or convenience store, and someone moved that filling station, I think, as I recall, when they closed it down. Of course, Reed made the medicine shop out of the grocery store, and sure been a lot of changes over the town over the years, and a lot of stores. Well, of course, Henry Porman used to have a grocery store, and Kenny Van Arsendale's dad,
Oh, yeah.
and then there was the donut shop over there where I started in business. Jim Davis had a donut shop in
Donut
there.
shop.
Yeah, and
And those donuts were super, too, as
they
I recall.
were, and he got up early in the morning, and they'd be just super, those donuts.
So you graduated, I think you said, from the high school in 1954?
54.
What was your track after that?
Well, I had went to work for Morris Staub. Morris Staub came to town, and he was located down there in the Knowles building right next to Barney's barber shop. I shined shoes over at Barney's for a while, and
Oh, yeah.
Barney and did it, run errands for Sylvia, and kept track of Lucky, the dog, because he'd take off sometimes and get away from him. Well, anyhow, then when Morris, he'd went and taken schooling in Chicago, and he started his TV shop there, and then he went in business with Bill Taylor.
Yes.
And I started coming up looking for some work, and they would get their car cleaned and maybe waxed and do a little detailing, and then they'd start using me for run some service calls, and the next thing I knew, I was in with them, and because they wanted to sell stuff in the store and run the coffee shop, and they wasn't, well, they would work in the shop of fixing things, but they wanted someone else to do some of their errands, and so I started working for them. I started in part-time, and the next thing I knew, they had me working for them full-time. And
With the technology, I know then was totally different than what it is today, but did you go to some schooling or something to
I
learn
took a
about
correspondence course.
Okay.
While I was living at Clark Center, Carol Heatherly married Shirley Shade, and he thought he wanted to be a TV technician, and he signed up for a study course from DeVry. And he took about 2 lessons, and he said this wasn't for me. Well, he had to pay for the course, and he asked me if I would take it. So I transferred it over in my name, and I started studying, and I would, if I had any questions, I could go with Morris to answer my questions, but I got a lot of practical experience, and that's how I learned most of it. But I did finish the course and get a diploma, and there was so many people that just went to work for another technician and learned what they could and really didn't know the theory behind television whatsoever. They just knew how to work on them from doing repetitive repairs. Well, anyhow, it was quite different because you had people working on them that really didn't know what they were doing, but they was doing repetitive repairs, and you had people that got the hard ones fixed because they knew the theory and could figure out what was going on. And well, anyhow, because you take if a resistor changes value or an unusual problem, it was difficult to run down, and sometimes would never be run down because it never got in the right hands. They just say, well, it's not worth fixing. But anyhow.
And John, over the years, there were so many companies that made TVs back then that are completely off the radar now.
Well, big ones is gobbled up, especially like in the appliance business and some of the RCA. They don't even make an RCA anymore. They don't make any.
Zenith name, I don't think so on anything.
Zenith was LG absorbed them. It was a Korean company, and they absorbed them, and they made a Zenith set for a while, and finally it just went to the wayside. And some of the, well, it's hard to figure out why some of them went under RCA was, I think some of it was mismanagement. They just made bad choices and caused their own problems, and sometimes it was technology, you know, they just lost out. And, well, anyhow, a lot of times when I remember at one time, the hand wired sets, everyone was talking about the hand wired sets, and Zenith was one of the ones. Well, then RCA, of course, had printed circuits, and they was selling against RCA, and they was trying to promote the hand wired sets, and then Zenith started using printed circuits, and well, it's perfected now. And so Zenith thought now was the time to go with printed circuits, but printed circuits got its place, and there's good ones and bad ones.
Are there still some of those old sets still in operation that are functioning well?
I've got in my store over there, Hoffman was one of the older sets, and they was a good set. And I've got some over there that I saved. I got a Zenith, a 1955 it was a 21-inch set, boy. I remember when they came out with 17-inch, and that was a giant size, 17. And and then they come out with 21-inch, then 24, and then a 30, and now they've got, what, 36, and they're like a tank. They're so heavy. But, well, they finally decided that they couldn't make those picture tubes and make any money. They had to change the display, and that's what it's been about the last few years, is changing the type of display from either a plasma or an LCD, and you know, they've made different displays, and some's been good and some's had lots of problems, but they perfected them to a certain degree.
Now, that old Hoffman set that you mentioned, if you put a high definition converter on it, I assume you can still get a good picture on there?
Well, see, the thing is, we had a good signal. We could watch signal. We had a good antenna, and we had something that would pull the signal in pretty good. And they sold us a bill of goods. They started with these high definition TVs, and they decided they better sell us a digital signal. Well, they sold it. It was just a theory. They took away a good signal and give us a signal that's unreliable. One that the sound fades out, the weather, a storm will cause it to lose audio or video or both. And so what we're left with is an unreliable signal that people that spent hundreds or even $1,000 or more for a good antenna, and it was useless because the signal was different. And you couldn't depend on the signal, and they left us for the satellite cable companies to sell a signal in a package and get money. It's pay TV then. It's not, well, and you need a box. They change, you have to have a box and you can't pull the signal very far because it's an inadequate signal. And I just got on to I didn't get on to him. I spoke to the manager out here at McDonald's. Ever since this owner bought this, he's had a snowy picture. It's unacceptable. But no one's complained until I did today. They was having a meeting, and I thought I would clue the manager in that they're paying for service that they're not getting. And they really need me or somebody that knows how to correct their problem, but no one's complaining, so they've got nice TV on the wall with a snowy picture, and there's no reason for it other than there's a problem that needs to be corrected. And either the tuner's bad in the TV, or it's not getting the signal properly. But if the signal was like that off the satellite, the picture would be pixelating and audio would be dropping out, because that signal, when it gets weak, that's what happens. It's unreliable. But they're getting the signal okay.
We've got old sets, and we got one of those box converters, but every once in a while it'll come up weak signal, and it'll be, so to me, it's not nearly as effective and dependable as the old things.
That's
what you're saying.
absolutely right.
That's what you're saying.
Because the politicians is the one that decided on this change, this better digital signal. That's what is sold, is better digital signal, so that we get to use the signal that we're getting. Well, the thing was, it was for the cable companies to sell a signal. That's what it was for. And it was a money thing. Well, anyhow, America's got second-rate TV now because of our smart politicians that's on the take for money all the time.
I wouldn't debate that one a bit.
Well, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. And it's more prevalent than ever in the last 8 years. It's more prevalent in the last 8 years. We've lost more, but it's on both sides of the fence. But I was a Democrat, but I'll never accept what they've gave me the last 8 years, and they never said a word. They accepted everything. They didn't even accept his credentials. In other words, he isn't really qualified to be president, and they never questioned it. They went along with everything, and he's done everything wrong. Well, that's my opinion. So I'm not satisfied, and I'll never vote another Democratic ticket until something is
Changes. Well, I think you're probably echo a feeling of a lot of people on that one, but I won't get into politics.
Yeah, well, okay. We won't get,
But I do tend to agree with you. Well, with the work in TVs, what moved you over into things like refrigeration and air conditioning and some of the other things?
we sold Taylor's, and Staub and Taylor, when they was in it, they sold appliances. They sold Norge.
Right, good with
And Norge was a good product. Their washers and dryers, they had a good washer, but it had some problems, weaknesses. But at the time, like in the 50s, they had a pretty good washer. They was top rated in Consumer's Guide. But they had refrigerators too. Well, they came out with an ice maker. Well, the ice makers was unreliable. They worked, but they was broke more than they was fixed. Well, anyhow, then when I went in business in 58, I got out of the service. I worked for Bill up until I got out of the service the first time, and I was working for Bill when I got out, and then I went in business in January of 58, I think it was, 50. Anyhow, I opened my store, and I didn't think I wanted to. I was wanting to consider what appliances, and I didn't know what. I'd always worked on Zenith TVs and other TVs too, but I didn't know. And I talked to the salesman that sold RCA, and then Zenith had always talked down about RCA so much that I was uncertain about their quality. But anyhow, I took them. Well, he had Whirlpool, and so I bought some refrigerators, and I didn't get any ice makers, and he wondered why. And I told him the ice makers wouldn't work. He said, well, that's where you're wrong. He says they'd work, and they work exceptionally well. You know, I got so much business out of the county. They sent me a little placket that you hang on the wall for getting a certain amount of business out of the county for ice makers. I've got a whole row of those things over there in the store where I got the big enough percentage that I got a placket each year, and I hung them on the wall, but they never meant that much other than the fact that I sold my share of refrigerators. And well, when you sell appliances, they have service training because they want to give the customer exceptional service. And so we go to training, and even when I worked for Bill, that's what we did. We'd have at least once or twice a year, we'd have some training on different things, aspects about service. Well, anyhow, I learned most of my refrigeration from that. And we was a factory authorized service center for Whirlpool, Frigidaire, and of course washers and dryers. We serviced all their appliances and dishwashers. And of course with televisions, the same thing goes. They'd have service training. And so with that, you would learn different techniques on locating problems. And they had a tech line that if you got stumped on something, they had someone you could talk to. So anyhow, it made for good training and giving exceptionally good service, even in a small town.
John, as companies keep, I guess, improving technology, they're always coming out with new models. So did that really cause part of the need for additional education?
Oh, well, yeah, there's always changing. I mean, I remember back in 55, they had, remote control TVs, and Zenith came out with a Flash-O-Matic. And then what they did was they had a flashlight, and they had eyes on the front of the TV. And it was just a gimmick to shine the light at the particular eye to get the function that you want. Well, then you go into a certain house where they got a lot of windows and you have a lot of glitter, and this light would flash and cause the TV to, so you had to position the TV where it wasn't affected with flashing lights. But different things has occurred, or features that comes in that requires you to take a little different look. The remote control, some of them work off tuning forks, and sometimes electronic signals, transducers, and things like that. And so you had to keep upgrading your education all the time in order to know how something works. You got to know how something works if you're going to try to fix it. And so it's a matter of kind of keeping up and understanding what's going on so that you can take care of problems like that as they arise.
My dad bought a TV, it was a Zenith TV way back, I'm going to say somewhere in the early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And they came out with a remote control, but it had kind of a pinging sound to change the channel.
Okay, it's a tuning fork.
Yeah, you use the phrase tuning fork. And I didn't think it worked, I guess.
It had a little trigger on it that you pulled the hammer back when you pushed down, and then it would hit that tuning fork, and it vibrated a certain frequency, and they had a
microphone then to pick it up.
Microphone to pick it up and separate the functions. It'd have one tune for one frequency, one for another, and so you got the job done, turn it either off or on, or changing the channel one way or the other.
I hadn't even thought about that until you mentioned it here.
And mute the sound. And that's the most important on it anymore, is they got so much background noise and they sensationalize everything. You can hardly hear what's being said for the background music that you don't ask for. And so the mute button is a necessary thing anymore, because I just mute it when they play the background music so loud that you can't hear what they're saying. And
then the phone rings. So
yeah.
That's a way to move.
Yeah. Well, see, that was a feature on Zenith one time, and they had a feature on Zenith where you could answer the telephone on the TV and talk to them.
I forgot about that.
Oh, it's been a long, long way.
We've seen a lot of changes, a lot of advancements in that. John, back even as a child or high school, did you develop some hobbies and things that you like to do? Maybe
Well,
even
yeah.
today?
Well, I was their fixer when I was in school. They had me working on a lot of different things because I try to figure things out. The popcorn machine, or everything that they had to have some service. It seemed like, and the PA system, everything was needing some service at one time or another. And I would usually get the call to go work on it because I was a fixer. Don McNary, of course, I grew up, his parents used to run a grocery store there in Clark Center, and he was going to high school then, and he was tall, and he was a basketball player. And anyhow, Retha, of course, I think I've got family pictures where Retha and some of those kids was hitchhiking to school. They took their picture, hitchhiking to school. Anyhow.
With the development and getting into the technology thing of TVs and appliances and all, you married a young lady somewhere along that way too, didn't you?
Yeah, in 61, after I got out of service and my dad passed away, I met Wilma.
I'm sorry, John.
That's all right. I'm getting used to it, but anyhow, we dated, and anyhow, she worked at TRW. I'd worked on her car radio, and she'd had it worked on a couple other places, and I got it going, and so we started dating and going to a movie, and she had a nephew that was blind at an early age, like 26 years old. He died right after we got married, he died. But anyhow, we rented an apartment up here off of Don Arney in Retta, and about 2 weeks after we got married, I got my orders to come back to the Army. So when that time arrived, I think it was in December that I was supposed to go. And so I went out to Fort Riley, Kansas, and me and another friend that was in the Army with me before, we both got recalled. And anyhow, we got a place to live, found a place to live so we can get our wives out there. And then we had to go back for a year, they said. Well, anyhow, we went back to Fort Riley, Kansas, and then I found a place to live off post, but I had to live on post until we got Wilma out there. And then when we got back out of the service, that's when we decided to go in business. And she decided she was just going to quit. Well, she didn't quit right away. I had Wanda Wallace help me some for a while as a kind of like a secretary, and I went over into the old donut shop building where I worked with Staub and Taylor and started my business there. And after we was there for about a year, my wife, she quit her job. Well, she was in a wreck. That's what it was. She was in a wreck. And she had a wreck out here on Livingston Hill. She and Lucille was going over to get some things at Terre Haute, do some shopping, and I was working on a car out at Auburn. And so we had supper that evening. We was living up over Hedges clothing store, and I went by and I looked in the restaurant and I seen Tom and Charlotte DeShiel sitting in there, and so I went in and spoke to him, told him I was going out to work on the car and Wilma was going to Terre Haute. Well, anyhow, I got out there and got to working. After a bit, Tom and Charlotte drove up and they told me that she had been in a wreck. And so they took me to Terre Haute, and they didn't know whether she's going to make it or not. And anyhow, they just said that they'd have to wait and see in the morning how she done. They put her in intensive care, and her roof of her mouth was tore loose, and she had broken ribs, and her jaw was broken, and she was just in terrible shape. Well, anyhow, she pulled through. And when her arm got broke, her radial nerve didn't work, so she couldn't raise her hand, and they wanted to take a bone out of her hip and go in there and fuse that bone. And she said, no, we're not going to do that. She said, we're going to give it time to heal. And in about a year, that started coming back to her, and she was over at the APNS clinic, and she seen this Dr. Conforti. He was her doctor, and she put her hand up and waved at him, and he couldn't get over it. He says it's just a miracle that came back. But when you break your arm up here, there's a nerve that wraps around that bone in your upper part of your arm, and it bruised that nerve so bad that it was a long time, but they put a pin in it so they didn't have to put a cast on it, and they took that pin out. But anyhow, it was just something that it had been bad so long they didn't think it was going to come back, but he was wrong and she was right. She said we're going to wait, and I'm glad she did. Well, anyhow, but she was always helpful for me. She helped me in the store, and she just didn't cause me any problems. She never wanted everything. She was fairly conservative, and she didn't have to have a lot of things. She liked to have nice things, but she liked to keep nice things nice after she got them too. She wasn't always wanting something.
And John, I don't know, I think I mentioned to you one time, sometime back, I grew up a couple doors down from Wilma Mackey when she was a youngster.
Yeah, she told me.
She taught me to ride a bicycle.
Oh, I know. She told me that she had been around you when you and your wife would be around. She would say, you know, she had knew you, and she had been around you in younger years, and well, the same as, that Wendell White.
Yep.
He'd caused her to get a whipping one time for something she didn't do. And so, anyhow, he was riding by her house one day on his bicycle, and she had a broom. She went out there and sucked at her. And of course, it throwed him off, and he skinned his hand all up, you know. Told him, now, next time you tell a lie on me, you better think twice. But
fixed his bicycle, dude, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it did. But anyhow, he knew what he was getting it for.
I like it.
But anyhow.
And you have a son?
Yeah, let's see, I'm thinking about 1960, 58. It was 4 or 5 years. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think when he was born. But anyhow, we had a son, and he's been a dandy. But he's been involved with the business about, she never would just, well, we've won some trips and she's let people take care of him, but she wouldn't go to Acapulco with me. And I was out at George Mitchell's and Millie said, let me take care of him. And when I spoke to her that evening, I said, Millie Mitchell wants to take care of John David while we go to Acapulco. And she said, well, we can go then, because she said, I know George will be close by. So anyhow, we went to Acapulco, and Millie took John's playpen over to George's. And then I think Dolores took care of him once or twice when we went to Spain and Jamaica. But anyhow, we got to travel abroad, and I'm glad we did when we did, because otherwise we'd have never done it. And it was just trips that we got through from the business, selling stuff that
Wonderful.
we normally would sell anyhow. And so it really, there was a time or two that I couldn't take it, and I allowed either the help or my brother and his wife to take the trip, because they was sometimes that we just didn't feel like we needed to take that trip.
And John, you didn't mention your son's name.
John David. And anyhow, he, back when he was small, I took pilot training. And of course I soloed, and then I took him and Mom in the airplane a few times, but I let him think he was flying the airplane a time or two, but he wasn't. But anyhow, we had a good time at doing it. But anyhow, I flew probably 200 or 300 hours, and so I was good at. I went over to Casey and flew over there with Kern Padgett, had the lower wing, and I over at Sky King, Herman Brown had that, and he had Cessnas, and I flew Cessnas and the low wing aircraft, and I forget now but they handle a little differently. I mean, of course, they're built differently, but it's good to know both of them. And we have shows to go to sometimes. One time Wilma didn't want to go, and we had some friends that lived out there by us that she worked for us, the guy's wife, Bill and Jackie Weagle, and I asked Bill if he wanted to go with me to that show. Well, yeah, he said, well, we just got an airplane, went over and got an airplane and flew over to Decatur and left the plane there and went to the show. And then about 11 o'clock that night, we went back out and got in the plane and flew back to Terre Haute and landed. Well, it was an interesting adventure, because some things happened that we went, and after the show, got out of the show, we went to this restaurant and had us a meal, and I lost my billfold. Well, anyhow, I didn't know it until I got out to the airport, took a cab out to the airport, and reached my billfold to pay him, and I didn't have no billfold, so he called the office and they radioed, or they talked to the restaurant. Well, they found my billfold, and so we went back and got it, and they brought us back. Well, anyhow, you just have all kinds of things happen to you that sticks in your memory.
John, I know where you are now in the business. Used to be flower sales and service, was a Pontiac, and I believe John Deere dealer. What year did you acquire that building and move your business into?
Well, see, when I started, I went over here in the old Staub and Taylor building, and we was in there for about two or 3 years, a little over 2 years, and while I was there, I bought the old E&L restaurant down there across from the Senior Citizen Center, and I used it for a warehouse because I was selling quite a bit of product, and I didn't have very much room where Nancy was at, and so I put my used refrigerators and some of my new ones was in the carton, because it didn't take but one truckload to fill up that store that I was in. So anyhow, then I decided, well, I better get I had moved into the E&L restaurant building and took over part of it, and Louise Crummer, she had the front end for a beauty shop. I took the back end. Then 10 years there, well, that was the 70s, and I sold quite a few air conditioners, and I had a bunch of air conditioners on guaranteed sale. They sent me a truckload. I had them there in the store. Bob Flowers, he was wanting to sell me that there building. And I thought, well, it'd probably be better if I had a little better bigger building, because I need someplace to store this stuff. They was going to leave them with me. I purchased them, and then they took them back on guaranteed sale, but they left them in my building. So I had to have a room for it. So anyhow, that's when I bought off of Bob Flowers. I bought that there building over there. Well, then that was in 80. And then I got over there and we moved. We had that elevator in there where I had an El Camino, and we filled it up, and we'd drive it over there and put it on the elevator and take it upstairs and drive down there and unload it in a pile of things that we just put it in piles and drove by. Well, we got moved over there, and then sometime after that, then they come along, they wanted to be a Radio Shack, and of course, I was kind of against that because I was already in the electronics business, and I wasn't sold on the way they done business. Well, anyhow, I finally got talked into it, and we took on the Radio Shack franchise, and it lasted about 10 years, about 90, and I sent them on their way. And then I still had quite a bit of product. That was the problem with them, is they wanted you to buy product whether you sold it or not. They want you to either sell it or give it away so you can buy more next month. And well, anyhow, that didn't work out with me. I wanted to be realistic about it. If I wasn't selling it, I wasn't going to buy it. Well, anyhow, and I figured as long as my name was out there, I was the one that was making that decision. I didn't need someone to hold their finger on me and say, you buy this, and they threaten you with taking your franchise away if you don't sell enough product. So anyhow, I didn't care for that, so I sent them on their way. And I was better off for it, because you don't gain anything when you agree to something like that. that's not good for you. So anyhow,
One last thing kind of in our wrap up here. I know you've had an interest in cars.
oh yeah.
Want to tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, when I worked for Staub and Taylor, my dad came into town one day. He says, John, I had an old Dodge car that I bought that it ran, but I didn't know how well. I mean, I knew it ran, but I didn't know how reliable it was. And he says, John, he says, there's some people out at Clark Center that is having car trouble, and they need to get on their way. And he said, I thought maybe you might trade them that Dodge car for that car they got and just even up, and then you can put a new motor, another motor in it, a different motor. I said, well, if you think it's, I said, you've seen the car. I said, whatever you think. Well, I only had maybe $20 in this Dodge. And so I said, I'll go ahead and trade with him. So he traded, and they took the car and went on their way. I don't know whether they made it home or not. But anyhow, then me and Tommy DeShield put an engine in it. We went over to D&H and bought an engine put in it. Well, we drove that son. And then while I was in Arizona in the service, I drove it back and forth to Arizona.
Oh, that's a lot of space.
Oh, yeah. I even went to Las Vegas with it one time on a weekend. And I drove it home on leave a time or two. But anyhow, and then that's what I was driving when me and my wife got married when I got out of the service.
What kind was it?
A 52 Willys.
Okay.
And it was looked like a little like a Henry J. You know, it was a small car, but it was a Willys. And I'd like to have one of them now. That's one I wish I had, because it had an overdrive. It was a straight shift with an overdrive, and it got good gas mileage. Of course, it's kind of like that car I got now. It's got a good gas mileage. That little Lumina, I got it here a while back from a customer. It was just one that he bought it new, and it was just sitting in the garage, but it had 200,000 miles on it, and it hit a deer.
Ooh.
So but anyhow, then I'd had other cars, but this here one was one me and Tom had fixed up a wrecked 56 Ford that had went end over end, so we learned a little bit about body work and replacing things, and we got a pretty good education on it because we had to do about everything to it. And it ran good. We could take it out and drive it a little bit and while we was fixing it. But anyhow, then over the years, I bought a 47 Ford off of Gail Titus, and let's see, I bought the old Dewey Buick, John Lewis's. You remember the Dewey place up here on South 5th Street? They had a Buick, and she had got kind of careless at driving, and she had it all dented up where she had hit curbs and stuff. And anyhow, John Lewis and I was good friends. Dad used to work with him some, and he sold that car to me. We used to go drink coffee there at Pearl's Cafe. And anyhow, I got that Buick. Then, now let's see, I've got a old 54 Ford that Dale Veach used to own, and he was from Auburn, and Ross Pine had it, and then I think Bob Weaver had it a while, and I got it from Bob Weaver, I think. It was sitting out there. But anyhow, I've still got it. One time we went over by Rockville or someplace and we bought a Nash. It's a it's an American Motors car, but it looks like one of those hot dogs, you know, it's kind of rounded. And I got one of them, and of course, I've had Model T. Me and my wife went and bought a Model T one time from a guy down here at Willow Hill. It was a pickup truck when we got it, and then I took the bed off of it and I put a turtle deck on it, and it was a roadster, and I got it about a third done maybe, and then a fella come along, Herman Schatz, and he wanted to buy it. I was pouring tower down south of town here, and he was come down with concrete and was going to pour the base for that tower. And he got talking to me about that there roadster, and I sold it to him. And then I think he sold it to his brother-in-law, or it was Charlie Blankenship. He had it. And then the next thing I knew, he lost it in a divorce, or what the story came to me was he lost it. Anyhow, I don't know who's got it now, but he's the one that finished, not Chuck, but Herman's the one that kind of finished it up, Herman Schatz, and of course he's gone now. And
those cars seem to keep going on and on and on forever.
And I got a 36 Ford 5-window coupe. Now it's fixed up and it's in nice shape. And I had that 27 Ford or 27 Chevy that we'd had a near-death experience in out here back when I was working for Staub and Taylor. I bought this Chevy off of Junior Spittler, I believe. Anyhow, we was having trouble getting it to run, and I had the hood off of it so I could get to the engine real easy. Well, anyhow, the guy come along and says, "What's wrong?" I said, "Well, we can't get it to start." He said, "Well, let me give you a shove." So we pushed it out in the alley, and he was drinking, and I should have known better. Well, anyhow, he pushed us out in the street and down Main Street and out of town, and he got getting up about 50 miles an hour out here before he got to the cutoff. I thought, boy, I don't know whether I'm going to like that or not, because it didn't start, so there was something wrong, you know. Well, instead of stopping and quitting, he took us out on the highway, and when we was going down over the hill, he was seeing how fast he could go, really, and it went up past 80 miles an hour, and I was scared to death. Those boys that was with me, Tom DeShiel and Darrell Liffix, and they was turning around in the seat, you know, trying to get him to, and he lost control of his car, and he sideswiped my dad. Then he hit another car head on, and he didn't go to the service the next day. He was in the hospital. And anyhow, we coasted clear across that bottom, turned off on that road to go to Spiketown, and parked it, and we hitchhiked back to that there wreck. And that's when I found out that he had sideswiped my dad. And he had just destroyed his car, just went down the side of it and destroyed it. And, well, anyhow.
If a car won't start, leave it to...
Yeah, well, then we pulled that thing back to town and put it down there in front of my brother's house. And you know, the insurance company, they was down there taking all kinds of pictures of that, trying to throw some blame on me for that accident, which I didn't have no blame. He was the one, there was no way they could get out of it. But anyhow.
John, it's been a delight visiting with you. I really enjoyed talking to you, and you've done exactly what people do, is tell their story.
Yeah.
I have one question I usually ask about everyone, the last thing. You've grown up in Marshall and you've been here, but if you were, say, back in Spain again or somewhere else, and you said, "I'm from Marshall, Illinois," they said, "Where on earth is that? And what's that all about?" What would you tell them about Marshall?
Well, I'll tell you what I did in the service. They asked me about that, and I said, well, I knew it was a small town. I tell them, well, it's where the streets cross and the porch lights burn all night. But I says, it's near Terre Haute, Indiana. And so then I had a guy that was in the service with me, and I went down to see him, and I found out he'd been up here trying to find me in Terre Haute, Indiana, because he thought that's where I was from. But anyhow, we got together and we visited back and forth, and him and his wife came up. I took him over to the Covered Bridge Festival, but anyhow, we've been in touch with one another, and still in touch yet today by the computer, with emails.
That's great. Well, I've enjoyed this very, very much, John.
Well,
And we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to come and visit with us and put it on tape for future.
Okay.
As I say, this is not for today or tomorrow, but really for people in the future.
Yeah.
The name implies history.
yeah, okay.
To find out about Johnny Hoggatt.
Okay, well,
It's
thank
been
you.
a real pleasure. Well, let's see.